a theology of faith and a theology of hope. They merge in many places.
If I could go back and do things again, I'd be an ethno-linguist. If I find that stuff
fascinating, yeah.
I find it fascinating. Anybody else experiences of Presbyterianism in your lifetime? Anybody that besides Marlena attend a Presbyterian church? Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, the only experience I had with it was the Moreland Presbyterian Church had a similar experience to King of Kings when they were trying to set up a situation where people could park in their parking lot.
Yeah,
They had the same experience as King of Kings. It blew up in their face. And
well,
they ended up accommodating somebody in the church eventually. Yeah. But I have to say, I was the president of the neighborhood association in Selwood at the time, and they were probably among the nicest group of people I ever met. So my record was clear. I still haven't met a Presbyterian I didn't like.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the Moreland folks are great.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I knew the guy that was youth director there for a while. He's got his own church somewhere else now, but yeah, they're wonderful. I don't know. I think there was a Presbyterian church in Alpena, but my kind of first remembered experience with Presbyterianism was actually in seminary, where similar to last week, we part of one of our courses was we had to visit, I think it was 5 different Christian denominations aside from Lutheranism. We had to go to a worship service. And I went to a Presbyterian church in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it was totally, I did no research into it. I'm pretty sure all I did was Google Presbyterian church close to me. I think there was Google at that time. Anyways, and so I went to this one. And it just so happened they were doing, hold on one sec. Yeah, they were doing Mozart's Coronation Mass for Sunday morning worship. They had a chamber chorus and a chamber orchestra. And basically the worship service was we walked in, sat down, said a couple of prayers, and then listened to this Coronation Mass for about half hour, no sermon, sang a song, and then got out of there. And I was like, why am I not Presbyterian? Like, I didn't know this was an option. That was pretty great. And so it was funny because Katie Pate, who's pastor at Milwaukee Presbyterian, I mentioned that to her, saying, aren't you guys really into music? And she's like, that doesn't really sound like anything we do. It's like, oh man, I thought this was just like a characteristic of Presbyterians is that you guys did this, but it must have been something unique to that congregation.
And that day.
And that day, yeah. And well, if I remember correctly, they had like a quarterly, it was basically, they had a quarterly event where it's on Sunday morning, they would have this chamber chorus, chamber orchestra do some kind of musical presentation. But I think it was because they had a relationship with, this musical group or whatever, I thought that was pretty cool though. So that's the sum total of my no, that's not true. I mean, so us in Milwaukee Presbyterian have been in pretty tight relationship, as you guys are aware. And we don't discuss theology a whole lot, but as far as I can tell, there isn't a huge difference between our theology and Milwaukee Presbyterians, at least. But we're going to talk a little bit about those differences and whatnot. Okay, Susan, you with the question we were just responding to was what experiences of Presbyterianism you've had. Do you have anything in your history or?
No, except that my partner's parents are Presbyterian. That's it.
Do you know which tradition were they PCUSA?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. They might predate that too, because PCUSA I think was 1983 when they merged. But again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, let's do quick history, and then we're going to talk theological. I'm going to try to do it so that we got half hour to talk, to have conversations about this stuff. All right, so here's quiz question number 1. Who is the theological figure responsible for Presbyterian theology on the whole? You got like 3 options here. Well, okay. I'll give you 50% for that one. Knox is one of them. But what's the theology? It's not Wesleyanism, that's Methodism. It's
Calvinism.
Calvinism, yeah. So Presbyterianism is out of the Calvinist strain of theological influence. unlike the Methodist Church, we can't point to a moment of time and say this is when the Presbyterian Church began, because there isn't one founder. The Presbyterian Church really is the Church of Scotland that expanded beyond it. So if you recall back to when we were talking about history of Christianity in Scotland and England, you really had, well, to really sum up hundreds of years of history, you had, I mean, Catholic Church that was really monastic in form, which was kind of one of the big differentiators between the church in Scotland and the church in England. Was the church in England was a little more loyal to the papacy, whereas the church in Scotland was more monastic in character. Remember that?
Mhm.
When Protestantism makes its way in, it happens kind of independently in Scotland and England. I mean, you've got the whole, of course, the Henry VIII thing that's going on in England. In Scotland, you have John Knox and other reformers that are beginning to, well, introducing Protestantism in the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands and Isles and all that stuff. And I'm really rushing through this. I'm not rushing. I'm really crunching it down here. There's a lot more nuance that happens. If fast forward a couple of hundred years, not a couple hundred years, 50 years after the Church of England breaks off, what you essentially then get is you get a conflict between the Protestant movements in the British Isles and the Catholic movements in the British Isles. And what ends up happening is that even the Protestant movement in Scotland takes on the characteristic of its Catholic predecessor, right? Where influenced by kind of monastic ideals, pietism, spiritual practice, that kind of stuff, contrasted with Church of England, which was really, I mean, bureaucratic in a way. I mean, it's about consistency of practice, consistency of, high church, really, in a lot of ways, maintaining the facade of the Catholic Church, but changing the theology so that Henry could have another wife. That's not a really great character, but that's somewhat true. So now we fast forward a couple of hundred years. We're in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries here. What Presbyterianism looks like is that it's literally the Church of Scotland. And if you go to Scotland today, the churches in Scotland are literally the Church of Scotland. That doesn't mean that there aren't different denominational presences. There is evangelicalism, there are Baptist churches and other stuff, but that is the church, and it's a Presbyterian in nature. Now, quiz question number 2. What does Presbyterian mean? Or what's the root of it?
Elders.
Yes. So presbyteros in Greek means elder. And so what the word Presbyterian describes is not their theology, but their structure. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this was kind of the major way that church was shaped. Was it had a lot to do with who was in charge and how that functioned. And again, this is the big difference between, for example, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, or the Presbyterian Church. Is the Church of England maintains that semblance of hierarchy that's in the Catholic Church, where you've got cardinals and bishops and all that. They stick as well. I mean, so one of the things that is important to understand about the Church of England, so in 1990 something, early 90s, the ELCA signed what's called a full communion agreement with the Church of England.
Right.
And one of the major pieces that caused a lot of conflict in the ELCA was that we had to sign what's called the Historic Episcopate, which acknowledges that we can trace a chain of lineage from all of our bishops all the way back to St. Peter. Yeah. And it's somewhat metaphorical, somewhat literal. Where this created conflict in the LCA, and I mentioned this last week already, was that, well, I mentioned it with regards to the Methodist Church having conflict, was that it means that in order to be ordained currently in the LCA, you have to be ordained by a bishop. So in other words, a pastor cannot ordain a pastor, a bishop has to ordain a bishop, because through that, you're connecting that pastor through the historic episcopate all the way back to Peter, right? Same. Peter was the rock on which the church is founded. We're guaranteeing that you're connected to Peter. Of course, we can laugh about it. It's kind of ridiculous. But currently, within the ALCA, if you want to be ordained by not a bishop, you have to file what's called an exceptional ordination. And during my tenure at Luther, there were actually several students who went through that process. I didn't see that it was worth my effort, and I didn't really care all that much. Bishop, pastor, whatever, some dude in a white robe. No, I'm being snarky. Anyways, so again, this is about differentiating between the Church of Scotland and Church of England. So Church of England, hierarchical, sticks with that mode. Church of Scotland is governed entirely by elders. So, and things have changed over time, obviously, but generally, if you're in a Presbyterian church, the church has a group of elders who are kind of the equivalent of, for example, a church council, but they have a lot more power, actually. You're not appointed, you're elected to the session, as it's called, the session of elders. And it would be great to have Katie here to present on this, and maybe we'll have that in the future, but of course she has Sunday morning worship as well too. But too many thoughts trying to make their way out at once. What distinguishes, for example, a Lutheran church from a Presbyterian church is that in a Lutheran church, I am considered a member of the congregation. Different ELCA churches will have different rules regarding, for example, whether the pastor is a voting member of council or not, but I am a baptized member of the congregation. A Presbyterian church, the pastor is not a member of the congregation, and that's intentionally so. They serve, and the way that preachers are described in Presbyterian churches is they are primarily there to teach, preach, and administer the sacraments. Similar calling to Lutheran pastors, in that I'm a minister of word and sacrament, but they really define the role of pastor in a Presbyterian church, so much so that they only can participate in an advisory capacity to the session. So they're not really expected or even empowered to make bureaucratic or administrative decisions regarding the finances or anything else of the church. In fact, they have a totally separate board of finances that handles everything, and the pastor is informed but doesn't really carry any decision-making capacity. So that's kind of like, those are some differences with regards to government. The other thing is, if the church is perhaps large enough, they may also have what's called a deacon board or a board of deacons, which is is essentially that finance board, but with a little bit more power. I'm probably describing this all wrong, but this is how I understand it. Regarding the Presbyterian Church in the USA, the primary veins of people coming over, the first Presbyterian Church was founded in 1644 in the US, in New York. And then a second major movement of Presbyterians was in actually Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, of all places. Was another
thing. Okay.
Yeah. Tons of Presbyterians came to Pittsburgh, apparently. And then I think it was North Carolina. There was also a big insurgency, a big emigration of Presbyterians. Primary ethnicity. Guess what the primary ethnicity of most Presbyterian churches in the U.S. is? Scottish. Yeah, primarily Scottish. They're all redheaded. No. Yeah. One, interestingly enough, one other place that you see historically a lot of Presbyterians is in New Mexico, because this is fascinating, because the Presbyterian Church at that time created a mission to New Mexico. This is before it was the state of New Mexico. This is when it was literally New Mexico, because they wanted to provide an alternative to the primarily Catholic nature of religion in that region. And so apparently there is a glut of Presbyterians in New Mexico. I don't know if that's, I'll have to ask Katie if that still is true or not, but I found that to be interesting in my reading. And then, sorry, Presbyterian denominations in the USA, the main one right now is PCUSA, and there are several other less large. PCUSA, similar to Lutheranism, is the more progressive, largest, and again, being a mainline denomination, more wealthy, more educated church. There are several Presbyterian movements in the U.S. and internationally. So there's a very conservative Presbyterian movement in South Korea. You may have heard. What else? I should probably look at my notes here. North America. I've got here. I can show you this real quick. This is the map of Presbyterianism in the U.S. Yeah. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. There, that's better. So you can see PCUSA right there. You've got the merger in 1983 towards the right-hand side of the page. But again, the three major veins so it's that 1706, I think, is that's the Pittsburgh folks. Yeah. And then, yeah, the dark lines of the major movements. So you can basically see how the two major movements that started out end up merging to form the PCUSA in the long run. And then there are a bunch of break-offs that kind of like re-merge with each other. But so the existing other Presbyterian denominations are Orthodox Presbyterian Church, Bible Presbyterian Church, the Cumberland Presbyterian, the Old Synod. I've heard Katie talk about them, and then the Reformed Presbyterians of the South. But we don't hear a lot about them, and probably for good reason, because they aren't that large. Numbers. Presbyterian PCUS. Oh, I didn't want that, you silly thing. Where did it go? And I'm still zoomed in. That's why it's freaking me out. 1.25 active members as of 2020. Almost 9,000 congregations. So again, ranking them in order of size, it's Methodists, ELC or UMC, ELCA, PCUSA. The major, they have something called a General Assembly that happens. I don't think it's every year. I feel like it's every 3 years or something like that. I can check that out in a bit. But they kind of similar to UMC and ELCA have a nationwide gathering on a regular basis. Then the thing that's also remarkable is that in addition to the church governance, so session is what governs the local congregation, then there's literally something called a meeting of the Presbytery, which is similar to our clusters. So it's not a synod wide. It's a little bit bigger than our cluster regionally or geographically, I think. But individual pastors and other leaders will serve on the Presbytery, and that's the way that they kind of govern their local churches. But they are much more congregational in nature than, for example, the Methodist churches, which has, your district, which is very top down. The Presbyterian church is very congregational, bottom up with that regard. Does that distinction make sense? They're similar to us in that regard, is that each congregation kind of decides on its own. Yeah. All right. Any questions about governance, bureaucracy, church structure, organization, or history of the Presbyterian. Matt.
Aren't they the predominant Protestant church in Northern Ireland?
Yes, good point. But they rejected Calvinism. They are unique in that they are a non-Calvinist Presbyterian expression. So they have the general structure, but their theology is different. And I can't claim to describe their theology in any great regard. But yes, that's a good point.
Is there more of a predestination historically with Presbyterian?
Yeah, we will talk about that. Yes, that is kind of and I would say that's kind of one of the markers of Calvinism itself, is that concept of predestination. Yeah. Any other questions about anything we've talked about? All right, let's talk theology. So, first thing to know, similar to Lutheranism, Presbyterian is a confessional denomination, meaning that it's got significance in two ways. How do I want to approach this? So they don't have essentially governing doctrine per se, but they make confession essentially we make confession saying we collectively profess these theological ideas to be core to our beliefs, right? So this is really a big difference, especially between, for example, Catholicism and a confessional denomination like ELCA, like Lutheranism or Presbyterianism, and that we don't have a person that says, here's the theology that Jesus told me we believe. We, as a collective, as a community, confess that these are the things which we believe, right? So this is why we have a really strong creed, at least for Lutheranism, we have a really strong importance of creedal confession, right? So we hold the Apostolic, the Nicene, and the Athanasian creeds to be confessional of our faith. But again, I'm maybe overemphasizing this. It's communal in nature, and that we collectively express these beliefs, not individually. So like one of the ways that it's really helpful to hear that, so Nadia Bolz-Weber has a great sermon where she talks about how, when we say the Apostles' Creed, it's not so much that every single person believe everything in the Apostles' Creed, but it's that collectively we affirm the different ideas of the Apostles' Creed, if that makes sense. So that's really something important to know about the theology of Presbyterianism, is that they are confessional in nature. So if you look at across the panoply of Presbyterian denominations, you will find that they have different confessions that they hold to. So the original building block is the Westminster Confession of Faith. That goes all the way back to 1646 from the Westminster Assembly. Now, the thing about the Westminster Confession is that it is dated. It comes out of the mid 17th century, so you can imagine that contextually it has issues in that regards. So there aren't many Presbyterian denominations that hold the Westminster Confession as their primary. The Church of Scotland holds it as key, but actually they hold to what is referred to as the Westminster Standards, which post-Westminster Assembly, there was then a further conversation around issue, and they adopted other things into their thing. So it's Westminster Confession of Faith, the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the Westminster Larger Catechism, the Directory of Public Worship, the Form of Church Government, right? So these are all different documents that they hold as being central to their theology and governance. But the PCUSA has what they refer to as the Book of Confessions. So the Book of Confessions contains all these things that I just named for the most part. So it's the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Shorter Catechism, the Larger Catechism, Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed, the Scots Confession, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Second Helvetic Confession. Interestingly, the Theological Declaration of Barmen. Does anybody know what the Barmen Declaration is?
Yep.
The Barmen Declaration is a Lutheran declaration, which, well, not just Lutheran, but it's the declaration made by the confessing churches of Nazi Germany decrying Nazism. It dates all the way back to 1934. Yeah, we should talk about the Barmen Declaration at some point because it's fascinating. So the Barmen Declaration.
Is that
Go ahead.
the pushed the oh crud. Never mind. Go ahead.
The what?
Don't listen to me. Sorry.
So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a signatory on the Barmen Declaration, if that helps clarify anything. Here, I'll read it for you. So the Barmen Declaration has 6 different theses. Source of revelation is only the word of God. Boom. Jesus Christ. Any other possible sources will not be accepted. 2, Jesus Christ is the only Lord of all aspects of personal life. There shall be no other authority. Number 3, the message and order of the church should not be influenced by the current political convictions. Number 4, the church should not be ruled by a leader, in parentheses, Führer. There is no hierarchy in the church. Number 5, the state should not fulfill the task of the church and vice versa. And number 6, therefore, the Barmen Declaration rejects the subordination of the church to the state and the subordination of the word and spirit to the church. So very pointed, but that's part of the Book of Confessions of the PCUSA. And then there are a couple of other things that figure in there. And this is the confusing part about Presbyterianism in the US. So there's the Presbyterian Church in the United States, the PCUSA. The other major denomination is the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which is the UPCUSA. But they're smaller. Anyways.
Do they have a different theology?
Yeah, they're more conservative, is my understanding.
Meaning,
This would be a great question for Katie. But I'm guessing that they tend to stick with a pre-Bartian understanding of predestination, which we'll get to in a little bit, and may or may not never mind. I'm not going to make anything that I can't talk about. All right.
The difference of could we compare it to the differences of the Missouri Synod and the ELCA?
I'm speaking incorrectly here. So the UPC USA was one of, I'm both right and wrong. Was part of the merger, but then, so when the PCUSA formed, what I just said, that acronym merged some of them merged to join to become the UPCUSA. Some of them broke off and I think maintained the same title, they became the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, the EPC. Anyways, again, this is why it'd be good to have Katie here. I'm trying to speak to things that are, it's mainly all these stinking acronyms. Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Not anachronism, acronym. Yeah.
acronyms. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk predestination. What do you know? What have you heard about the Calvinist idea or theology of predestination?
They got 2.
Describe.
They're double predestination. So it means, as I understand it, God not only, I'm going to get it wrong. It's very confusing.
Yeah.
God not only made people to go to hell. Oh, shoot. That's the second part. The first part is God not only elects people to go to heaven, it's that he also elected them to go to hell. And that is part of his creative picture.
Yeah. So as I understand it, the root Calvin's theology of predestination is Pauline in nature. Thanks, Apostle Paul. Where,
In the Latin.
yeah. So if you remember, is it Romans? God predestined humans for salvation is one of the phrases that Paul speaks. And so Calvin took that pretty seriously. And Calvin, so here's one of the other core pieces, is that core Calvinist theology is covenantal in nature, meaning that when they understand how humanity relates to God, it's via covenant. And so in original Orthodox Calvinism, there are two covenants. There's the covenant of mercy and the covenant of faith. The covenant of, and it's all has to do with Genesis 3. So when Adam and Eve God makes a covenant with Adam and Eve and says, you shall eat of any tree except the tree which I tell you not to eat, and you shall live forever and flourish and blah, blah, blah. I'm paraphrasing. That's the covenant of mercy, which they immediately break, thereby condemning them to death. Okay, so this is in the back of your mind, don't think Adam and Eve, think humanity, okay? Then you get the covenant of faith, which is the end of Genesis 3, where, it's end of Genesis 3 / the rest of Genesis, which essentially boils down to, if you have faith in God, God will save you from death, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Karl Bart, who I already mentioned, a Calvinist theologian of some significance. Has anybody read Bart? You have no reason to. Not that there's anything wrong with Bart. It's just Bartian theology is dense. He's, it's theology. It's dense in nature. I should.
He's very hardcore too.
Yeah,
Like
he's legit.
And he referred to often. So that's why I sort of peeked at him.
Well, the thing is that Bart marks a huge turning point in Calvinist theology, and Bart also then majorly influences Lutheranism and other mainline because of that. But that's a whole other class.
If you understand the writing period of that time as being very reactionary to what they're experiencing, and find it beautiful for what they are trying to do under incredible duress, then he's wonderful. If you're not living in in existential dread at the very second of I'm gonna die, maybe he's not so great.
Well, and so Bart also was a signatory on the Barmen Declaration and helped write it. So that's an important thing to know as well too. But he's Swiss. Bart is Swiss. So like other names that you might recognize with Bart, because they're all in the same, they were all communicating with each other, are Schleiermacher, that name is so hard. Soren Kierkegaard, is anybody, I think Jim, you've referenced Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
These are all folks that Bart was a contemporary with. So covenantal in nature. Now, here's the thing. I think Marlena, you may have mentioned this about something with regards to the sinfulness. So this is kind of a key piece of original undistilled Presbyterianism, Calvinism actually, is that he places a big emphasis in this idea of the utter depravity and sinful nature of human beings. And it's important to understand this because that is the other side of the ditch from predestined salvation, right? Because human beings are so utterly depraved and sinful, one of the things that Calvin posits is that they are therefore unable by any means to do anything that would ensure their salvation. Even faith, he argues. I mean, so he essentially takes Luther's idea of, sola fide and gives it steroids. He takes it and runs with it. And so, it's this idea of humans are so utterly depraved that the only way they can possibly be saved is that God picks them through some unknown and mystical means. They are predestined for salvation. But an important thing here is, in a world where some people are going to hell, you have to figure out a mechanism by which those people are going to hell. So there are unfortunately people who are predestined not to be saved. This is
It's a lottery system.
It's a weird lottery system.
Separate the sheep from the goats.
Well, that's what it is. That's what it is. And now it's a little, obviously there is much more nuance and it's a little more complicated than what I'm making it to be. But that's kind of the core issue. Okay. Now that is Presbyterianism pre-Bart. Okay. Which I'll come back to that in a bit. But so this is kind of the key issue. And again, I told you that when I learned ecumenical theology in seminary, it was all apologetic, meaning it was very critical of other faith traditions. So Presbyterianism, Calvinism, as I understood it, was all about predestination. And then the other key piece, this is one of the major differences between, for example, Lutheranism and Calvinism, is communion. So Lutherans theoretically believe in what's called consubstantiation. So real bodily, emphasis on bodily presence. So one of the Lutheran confessions is that in communion, we are eating the body and blood of Jesus Christ, physically present. Jesus is bodily present in the bread and the wine, which is different than the Catholic understanding of transubstantiation, which is that it literally transforms into Jesus's body and blood, which is why in the Catholic tradition, this is one of the justifications why only the priesthood drinks the blood, because it is literally the blood of Christ, and why they don't let any of the host, the body, be disposed of. It goes in the little box that gets put in that special place in the altar, right? That's why they take special care with these things, because once the priest says the magic words, it's literally the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Now, and again, this is an interesting debate. Lutheranism is about consubstantiation, which we argue that Jesus is bodily present. So we use this phrase that I learned in seminary. It's like in, over, and through, or something like that. In, under, and through, under, through. I'm a bad Lutheran. But it's this idea that Christ is present in the bread and the wine, but it's not necessarily his body. It's not like magically poof. Okay. Now, Presbyterian or Calvinism, on the other end of the spectrum, talks about real presence. Notice the word body has disappeared. So they argue that Christ is present during the meal, but you're not necessarily eating his body and blood. Now, the root behind this, interestingly enough, is because Calvin thought it was ridiculous, the idea that Jesus Christ could be bodily present in multiple locations at once. Not because God doesn't have the power to do that, but because that would be denying the humanity of Christ. So for Calvin, the idea of Christ being fully human meant that his body could only be present in one place at once. He can't be present on all the communion tables all across the world. That's just ridiculous. So that's kind of the historical argument. Again, I keep emphasizing historical because modern Lutheranism, modern Presbyterianism, we don't get quite as hung up over that stuff, and frankly leave a lot more ambiguity for that. So you're not going to get removed from the Lutheran Church if you don't sign a document confessing your belief in consubstantiation. Be helpful if you knew how to pronounce it at least, but I'm being snarky again. Similarly, in the Presbyterian Church, you're not going to find debates over double predestination or real presence, or stuff like that. I'm sure Katie could give a good class on it if she needed to. But okay, last thing, and then let's I want to give us some time to chat again. So I talked about Bart's influence. So post Bart, who was again a Calvinist theologian, Bart offers up some alternatives. So, for example, with regards to the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, he argues that predestination only applies to Jesus. So Jesus is predestined for death on the cross, but by extension, we receive our salvation through relationship with Jesus, through our oneness with Christ, which has nothing to do with our being predestined. That's how he handles that piece. And he also takes the teeth out of the total depravity argument. I can't remember how he. Oh, the other guy, Jürgen Moltmann, is one of the other major one of the major players. Yeah, he takes it. So okay, here we go. Now I can't find. I thought I had it. Oh, sorry. One other key piece. Core, really conservative Calvinism strongly clings to the penal substitutionary atonement model, which if you've watched any of my podcasts with Story Long, you will know is not. Penal substitutionary atonement is like a 4-letter word for me, man. It's the idea that Jesus dies because God is so angry at human beings that Jesus, steps in and takes the bullet for all of us, is a really reductionary form of it. Jill.
There are multiple Calvinist followings.
Yes.
Is Presbyterianism a penal substitutionary atonement one?
So some of the more conservative, original Church of Scotland was not quite so.
I thought they were Christus Vicar still.
Both. Well, but okay. But it's, how do I describe this? So penal substitutionary atonement, especially in, for example, the evangelical church in America, has teeth to it. The concept of penal substitutionary atonement that is present in especially conservative Calvinism it's not so wounding. Okay, it's connected specifically to the total depravity piece. Okay, it's more along the lines of humans are so unable to save themselves that Jesus is absolutely required for the salvation of human beings, and he needs to take the punishment that is rightly deserved by human beings. But it's less the idea that God hates humans so much that Jesus steps in and takes the bullet. It's more that humans are so utterly and totally depraved and sinful that the sacrifice of Christ is required, hence the substitutionary atonement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because again, when Marlena remarked on humans being totally sinful, yeah, you might hear that. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to make a distinction here. So if you go to, for example, Milwaukee Presbyterian's website and look at their faith statement, which falls under the heading Visions and Dreams, it's a totally different picture, right? For example, the 3 things are community, faith and growth, and service. Like their community statement, nurture and sustain a sense of belonging amidst all generations, create a sanctuary for busy lives, and create a space of healing and encouragement. No penal substitutionary atonement, no predestination, no total depravity, right? So again, I just want to be clear, when we're talking, Calvinism and Presbyterianism, we're somewhat talking a historical contextual creation, if that makes sense. I don't want to. So I only mentioned predestination to Katie once, and she just kind of rolled her eyes at me. All right, let's take 10 minutes, if y'all got it, to just chat about it, or to debrief this stuff. Out of all this theological mumbo jumbo that we've been discussing, anything that kind of piqued your curiosity, or you put a bookmark in, or wanted clarification on, or anything like that, or anything that you wanted to expound on?
I think it's so fascinating that great thinkers have come to so many variant decisions about salvation, and it's just fascinating that all these philosophers, great thinkers, arrive at a different interpretation of what salvation is, how you get it, how you get to heaven, how you avoid hell, and all those things. It's a fascinating study.
And something I remind folks of is that in rigorous theological study is very much a human creation, right? Yeah. It's driven by the human desire to answer the how question, right? For example, if you look at, our remembrance of baptism, we acknowledge that Christ, or that God creates us and that we are redeemed through Christ. It's a pretty simple statement, that God promises to redeem it, blah, blah, blah. If you just kind of say, okay, that's great, then you really don't need too much, theological reading. But if you're plagued by the question of, well, how does that work? That's where you arrive at, Jürgen Moltmann and Karl Bart. But to be fair to those guys, they're not just answering those questions on their own. They're responding to answers to those questions that predate them. And that's the real issue, is that, that's why we still read these folks, Kierkegaard, Moltmann, Bart, Schleiermacher. They exist in a culture and a context that very much took a lot of, what we would refer to as harmful theology, that took it seriously and held at its core. And so in many ways, they're theological reformers of saying, this doesn't quite jive with the way that I see the world, So I just want to say that to say that theological work is necessary, primarily in that it's necessary to deconstruct a lot of the theological creations that we have inflicted on each other over the course of years. Anyways.
Right. So Andy. I would have because you and I have somewhat of a scientific background. So where's the error statement?
The error statement?
The error statement. Is that all these people coming on and say, well, maybe it's like this, rather than, because it's predestination. Really? So therefore, why even bother? I mean, if that's your statement going in, why even bother going out?
You've hit at one of the key pieces here, because to be fair, there are only a couple of steps of distance between, for example, a theology of predestination and Lutheran theology of being so anti-works righteousness. We talked about this last week during the conversation around Methodism, is this idea that if your salvation is 100% guaranteed and has nothing to do with what you do, where's your motivation? So the way that Lutherans handle it is we talk about the importance of the law, the three uses of the law for inspiring. Well, one of them being to inspire human beings to imitate Christ in their life. Presbyterian, Calvinism talks about that being one of the markers of salvation. So right. It's a chicken and an egg thing here. So if you've been predestined, obviously one of the questions that you're going to want to ask is, well, how do I know that I've been predestined? And what a good Calvinist theologian might tell you is, well, it's evidenced through the spiritual markers of your salvation. So the way that, do you do charity? Do you practice piety?
and then you hit Revelations, who says there's a defined number of those that will be saved.
Yeah.
That sort of lets everyone else down the tube.
Doing
aren't that many.
Trying to hold to rigorous mathematics and biblical interpretation are two impossible things.
And then the last comment would be, it sounds a bit like, theological contemplation of how many angels can sit on the head of a pin.
You're exact. Yeah.
It's sort of ridiculous in one regard, and that's why you can see this modification coming in. Because I think it is an expression of realization that this is ridiculous, because, the only true answer that will ever be obtained is if God made a direct statement by himself, through himself, with no interpretation from anyone else.
Yeah.
We don't have that. We have through other people, not by himself.
Interesting.
Classic Luther does believe in the elect.
Yes.
So
Luther does.
We don't have that is, I don't know.
Yeah.
The way I've dealt with it, which is probably not orthodox, because I'm not trying to pretend to be so, is that, the elect really happens. Let's pick King David, for example. That guy's a messed up dude. He's also God's favored. He's an elect. The elect is not an exclusive club. insofar as you can't be like, if we're using our sermon today, the sheep are something different from, you don't get to participate in being a sheep because you're not a member of the elect. There are the elect. Martin Luther King Jr. is the elect. I am not a member of that club.
Yeah.
I get it. But it's not like a you get in only thing. But there are some people that are just standouts. That happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. Jim, you got your pencil raised.
I often muse on the three words, faith, reason, faith, hope, and reason.
Yeah.
And I you mentioned Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard maintains that faith was higher than reason, and most of the philosophers, I always sense, are trying to use reason to sort this out. So I sometimes kind of lean towards the Kierkegaard approach, where that I'm looking at some notes I have, that reason has its limits and faith begins where these limits of reason are found. And then the idea of hope, he kind of delves into that other of the three, faith, hope, and reason, that he believed that people of faith sometimes are people of hope, and he was not a great believer in hope because he thought faith was more than hope. But anyway, reason, I kind of lean toward the Kierkegaard that faith is a higher level than reason, and as a human being, I sometimes have to go there only through faith. I can't reason it out.
Yeah. And Jesse, one last thought. Your comment was I forgot exactly the comment. The point being is, to be ordained, you need to have a bishop do it.
Yeah.
The interesting comment I was musing on, and that was interesting. All these people that take that premise, all the individuals they go back to were excommunicated by the Catholic Church. So what is that?
Yeah, right. Little awkward, that one.
Yeah, like a break in the sequence.
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. Well, I mean, we signed the historic episcopate. It doesn't mean that they necessarily acknowledged our lineage or not. Yeah. Any other musings or thoughts? I wanted to point out one interesting historical thing. So did anybody else recognize the picture that Jim held up?
Oh, sure.
Yes, my folks had the same picture.
Yeah. So did
Yeah.
my grandparents had that hanging.
Yeah.
Right next to our dinner table.
Yes,
Right
it was above our dining room of my parents, my grandparents, and my great grandparents.
Yeah. So it hung.
Same one.
Yeah,
I'd like to have one of those myself.
So here's your quick history on it. So that is actually a photograph. So
Yes.
there are a couple of versions of it. The original is a black and white photograph that dates back to 1918. There are colorized versions of it, which kind of look like paintings. The one that my grandparents had was a colorized version where there's some subtle green and stuff that is interjected in there. But then obviously there have done paintings which have been interpretations of it. But it's a photo by a guy named Eric Engstrom.
Yeah.
And it was taken in Bovey, Minnesota, way back in 1918. And in 2002, the Minnesota state legislature established it as the official state photograph.
Oh, darned.
And it's published by Augsburg, of course.
Yes, yeah, of course it is. Yeah. I'm pretty sure at least 90% of Lutheran families have had that photo hanging somewhere.
Now, my parents also had a very similar pose, similar of a woman instead of the man.
Okay.
Elderly woman.
The story behind the photo is fascinating. I mean, you can go look it up on Wikipedia. Just look up, Grace photograph. But it's a photo of a guy named Charles Wilden, who was basically he was a peddler. He lived in a sod house, and so Enstrom took this photo of him because he just felt that it was just really a prime example of, again, this really pietistic spiritual person, and he entitled grace. Now here's the great, this will win you some trivia contests. So the book that's sitting on the table,
I know.
it's a dictionary. It's not.
When I read that, or I knew that, I thought, oh no, I don't want to know that.
Yeah, it's a dictionary. But so Enstrom had Wilden sign a waiver, and Wilder wrote Bible on it in order to fit in with Enstrom's
Theme,
depiction here.
Oh my.
I love that. That's one of my favorite.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating.
But here you go. So Enstrom licensed it through Augsburg Fortress in 1930.
Yeah.
And his daughter, Enstrom's daughter, is the one that colorized it by hand, actually, in 1940. So there you go. You guys learned something today. Me too.
My
Oh,
We've lost someone.
Yeah,
so
halfway.
it comes straight from Norway's Bode to Minnesota's Bode. That's the line.
Well, it's funny because I think I remember asking something about this photo at some point. And I don't remember who told me this, but I've been told several times that it's a photo of a Norwegian man.
Of course.
Little do they know. All right. Well, thanks, folks.